Verstappen took his 7th win of 2022 after Charles Leclerc saw another potential victory escape him as he crashed out on lap 16 at the Castellet. Mercedes grabbed their first double podium of the year, both drivers passing Sergio Perez, while Carlos Sainz fought his way back to 5th from the back of the grid. Is the title fight as good as over now? Will Ferrari ever get their act together on the pit wall? And how do I rate all the drivers' performances? All that to come on the 5 Red Lights podcast, the French Grand Prix Cap show. So it was a hot weekend in France. The tyres they probably weren't enjoying the north of 30 degree temperatures. Slightly better than what it had been previously in the week in France. I was fortunate enough to be in Paris on the Tuesday ahead of the race when it touched 42 degrees. For anyone who doesn't know what that feels like, it's not comfortable. So we all got a sneak peek in Europe as to how warm it can get on the continent, because we had a massive heat wave, and that continued into the weekend, and there was a lot of strategy sort of at play, potentially. But Charles Leclerc's error handed Max Verstappen a huge advantage and took away any possibility of a strategical race because he wasn't in it anymore. And after winning the French Grand Prix, Verstappen now has a 63-point lead over Charles Leclerc with 10 races to go. It was a crucial error, and Charles spoke before the race of the car being oversteering, but it seemed to be on a knife edge, and that seemingly was what caught him out. Ironically, the error came at the corner where Ferrari were at their most devastating against Red Bull all weekend. But up until his error, Leclerc had driven beautifully. He'd done a wonderful pole position lap on Saturday. He'd had the aid of Carlos Sainz towing him along out of the chicane on the Mistral Straight. And I actually tweeted that it might be Carlos Sainz who wins Charles Leclerc the World Championship, but come Sunday afternoon and the checkered flag, it was definitely Charles Leclerc who was going to lose Charles Leclerc the championship if he continues to make errors like that, or if the Ferrari strategy department keep dropping the ball, or the power unit keeps exploding. But from the start, Leclerc was driving very, very well. He did everything he needed to do. He was fast in all of the right places to keep his Dutch rival Max Verstappen behind in the early laps. And to be honest, when Verstappen got into DRS range on lap 3, I thought it was as good as done, because the Red Bull was so much quicker in a straight line. And yet, he wasn't able to pass. I think there was a tailwind onto the Mistral Straight, which makes DRS less effective. And we saw a few more overtakes into turn 1, or at least more opportunities into turn 1, which also resulted in a couple of collisions. But Leclerc was managing his race wonderfully well, and he did just enough to keep Verstappen at bay, and then was quick enough in the third sector to make sure he had enough of a gap not to be in trouble on the pit straight, and then was quick through the first sector again to make sure the Red Bull wasn't quite close enough to attack. There was one moment where Verstappen got to show his nose into Bossé, and to be honest, Charles covered the inside and just said, look, you're not coming through on the inside here, you're going to have to go the long way around. And Charles would then just take the racing line and force Verstappen into a decision as to whether he wanted to continue the race or not. And it forced Red Bull into going for the undercut. Maybe they would have gone with it anyway, but it was almost a certain two-stop strategy from there. The hards may have got to the end, but with Ferrari going longer and having that offset strategy, you would have expected Red Bull to try and turn the tables back on Ferrari and have fresher tyres towards the end of the race. Perhaps Ferrari would have gone longer and had an offset two-stop strategy, or just run a conventional one-stop. But we'll never know, because before they managed to pit Leclerc, he was in the wall. And that scream will haunt all Charles Leclerc fans around the world. It's a bit like the oh no Hamilton radio from Malaysia 2016 when his engine was on fire. It's racing, unfortunately. It's a shame that Leclerc is making these errors, and he's being let down as well by his Ferrari team in the fact that the power unit isn't as reliable as it perhaps should be. because we could have a absolutely thrilling championship battle. And that's not to say that it's perhaps completely over yet, and that's an answer I'll give in a moment. But if you think about it, it's another leading position thrown away to go along with Spain and Baku, where the power unit failed. And if you think about it, Charles, he would have won in Spain. There's no doubt about that. So that's 25 points down the drain. Baku, possibly second or third, although I think he was on the 2-stop back then, if I remember correctly. So he was in with a shot of victory, but almost certainly a podium. And you can put Silverstone into that group of lost victories as well, because there was the opportunity to pit Leclair, and they left him out, hanging him out to dry on the old hard tyres, and he ended up finishing 4th. When really he should have been ramming the fact that Verstappen was only 7th down the Red Bull driver's throat. And then you've got this one in France where Charles has put it in the barrier, and Verstappen has done just that. He's rammed it down Leclerc's throat and come away with 25 points and a very juicy championship lead. The big question, is the championship over in terms of a real competitive edge? It's hard to see how Verstappen's going to lose it from here, but I think Leclerc and Ferrari will do their utmost to close the gap. 63 points is a huge, huge gap. It's going to need something really, or 2 or 3 really catastrophic races for Max Verstappen to really put the cat amongst the pigeons and put Leclerc back in the title hunt. But as the great Murray Walker always said, anything can happen in Formula One, and it usually does. But unfortunately, the anything that can happen was Charles Leclerc blowing victory in Le Castellet. And the drama didn't end there for Ferrari. What is going on at Ferrari? They just seem to be second-guessing themselves at every turn, and yet they still have the fastest car. They've been on pole position more than anybody else this season. Well, only Red Bull have been on pole other than them. Both their drivers have had pole position. Leclerc has looked stunning over a single lap with 7 pole positions, but he's only got 3 victories. Sainz has got a victory, but then you look at Red Bull, it's the opposite way around. They've only been on pole on a handful of occasions, and yet they've won 8 races. Verstappen has 7 now. Perez has his win in Monaco. And it could have been so much more for Ferrari, even despite Leclerc being in the wall, because they could have been on the podium with Carlos Sainz, and they probably should have been. And I'm wondering if the Ferrari culture is inhibiting the pit wall performance. And it might have been Ted Kravitz or Karen Chandok on Sky Sports F1 who mentioned, I think it was around the British Grand Prix, about the lack of authority in their decision making and almost working in fear. And obviously you've got the tabloids out in Italy who are always on the case when it comes to Ferrari, and anything that goes wrong, and they take the people responsible to task. And that was something that Jean Todt did very, very well back in the glory years at Ferrari. They just blocked out all the noise from the newspapers. And it's that Italian passion that makes Ferrari so magical, but is also arguably their greatest weakness, because they're so concerned about getting it wrong, it seems. They don't know what to do. There's no authority on the pit wall, and that was underscored multiple times when Carlos Sainz was called into pit while he was battling with Sergio Perez. And obviously the TV feed is delayed from when it is obviously said, so there's maybe 30 seconds. So Carlos was probably at the other end of the track by the time that it was aired, or from when it was aired. But when we heard the message on the TV, he was actually going around the outside of Sergio Perez, pulling off a brilliant overtake into the final corner. A superb move from Carlos. And yet he was left in no man's land with his strategy. He wasn't helped by the timing of the safety car for Leclerc crashing. So he took the free pit stop. Because he'd started at the back, courtesy of engine penalties, he was starting on the hard tyre, and they had to go onto the mediums. So they could have run to the end because Pierre Gasly did it. But obviously Sainz was putting more energy into the tyre, having to overtake other drivers, and generally just pushing on a bit more. For me, it was worth the risk. He should have been on the podium. He had the 5-second penalty for the unsafe release with Alex Albon in the pit lane. And the worst case scenario would have been that the tyre had failed. But to be honest, Sainz could have managed the tyre to the end of the race. Unfortunately for Carlos, he was left hung out to dry as well with strategy, because pitting when they did, with about 10 laps to go, was completely the wrong thing to do. By that point, you have to commit to going to the end of the race, and what will be will be. They were going to pit him. You could say maybe they should have done it 10 laps earlier, but I have a different idea on this. I feel like because the pace was really good, he got past George Russell, and that had taken him a few laps. And a team with authority on the pit wall perhaps would have done this. As soon as he'd caught Perez, they'd have allowed 2 runs with DRS down the Mistral straight. And if he hadn't made the move, then call him in and put on the mediums. And that would have been perhaps 15 laps to go. He might have come out a little bit further back, but I don't think he'd have ended up behind Stroll. So he'd have probably come out where he did, which was in 9th. And then he'd have had a few extra laps to catch Perez and Russell, who were battling. Obviously there was the virtual safety car, which kind of slowed his progress, and they weren't to know that. And that's just racing, unfortunately, sometimes. But you've got to commit properly to a strategy. You've got to commit. And Ferrari just didn't do that. They were just having a meltdown on the pit wall. It was comical, laughable. And it's going to cost Ferrari not just a Drivers' World Championship, because there's a whole other myriad of reasons as to that, but it's certainly going to cost them a Constructors' Championship, because they've just handed extra points to Red Bull. If you're going to be aggressive and deal with the consequences. Don't try to be aggressive and then crawl out of it and then end up sort of nowhere. But coming from the back of the grid, Carlos Sainz picking up a P5 is respectable, but it could have been a lot more on a weekend where he was absolutely blisteringly quick. It's just such a shame that he had to put the new power unit parts in, because I think he would have had the measure of Verstappen this weekend. So before I dive into my driver ratings, I'm going to discuss Lewis Hamilton's 300th Formula One Grand Prix. I've been fortunate enough to be watching Formula One long enough to see every single one of Lewis's 300 Grand Prix. And I remember back to my teenage years, I was really excited about a young British driver coming into Formula One with McLaren. He was going to be partnering double world champion Fernando Alonso. And I think I speak for most people who were watching at the time that, you know, maybe a race win towards the end of the season, a few podiums. But we did not expect Lewis to turn up and destabilise the entire establishment of Formula One at the time. And since then, he's just been the fastest driver of his generation. Yes, there were the Vettel years with Red Bull, but Lewis was also in an underperforming McLaren team. But when the McLaren was on song, he was a match for Vettel in that Red Bull, and he also gave him a few runs for his money when he'd moved to Mercedes. And once Mercedes delivered the WF5 in 2014, Lewis's game went to another level. He had the war with Nico Rosberg. He came out of that a changed driver, and he hasn't looked back since. And you see now, even though he's got this car that is so difficult and just not what he hoped for this year. And off the back of how 2021 ended, he's still pushing, he's still motivated. I saw a tweet which referenced a quote from Toto Wolff saying that they could come to an agreement for another 5-10 seasons. They could get to 400 Grand Prix with Lewis, which would just be an astonishing achievement. And of course, that's considering if Fernando Alonso hasn't already retired by then, he might be the first driver to reach that milestone. But he's reached so many other milestones, and I'm just going to read through some that I'm finding here on Wikipedia. So, I mean, they should be fairly accurate because we all are fairly aware of what Lewis has achieved in Formula One. But it is also Wikipedia, so, I mean, take it with a couple of grains of salt. Obviously, the most world championships, a joint held record of 7 with Michael Schumacher. The most career victories to date, 103. Most pole positions, 103. He's got a win for every single pole position, which is just absolutely astonishing. The most wins in a debut season of 4, which is jointly shared with Jacques Villeneuve from 1996. Most wins in a season without being world champion of 10 in 2016. Most wins with the same team, 82 with Mercedes. Most wins at the same Grand Prix, Hungary and Britain, 8. Let's just scroll down. Most pole positions in a debut season, 6 in 2007. He's got the most pole positions at different circuits, 32 different circuits he's taken pole position at. And he's got 8 pole positions at Australia and Hungary alone, a joint record with himself, obviously. He's got the most consecutive podium finishes from his debut race, 9 podiums in a row, and that's what I'm talking about. He came in and just blew everybody away with his consistency and excellence, and but for one tyre failure at the Nürburgring, he would have been probably on the podium in that race. Well, maybe 2 tyre failures, because he had the tyre failure in qualifying and then the puncture in the race, which was a chaotic race. Go back and watch it, the 2007 European Grand Prix. Absolutely bonkers race. And, you know, had that wheel not failed, or the tyre not failed, and sent him into the barrier in qualifying, he would have been at least top 4 on the grid. We know how good he is in the wet, because he proved it later in the year. He would have probably handled that fairly well. He'd have probably picked up a solid points finish at least, maybe a podium. And that would have been the World Championship for him that year. It would have been a debut World Championship. He missed out on a debut World Championship by a single point. And he could have clinched it in China, but we all know what happened there. And there are just so many lists of records and youngest to do this, longest time between this and this. It's just incredible. And I feel so fortunate to have been able to watch Lewis's progress and share in his glory. He's not everyone's favourite driver, and that's fine. But for me, he is my favourite driver. He is the driver I look forward to watching the most, even now. And if he continues for another 5 to 10 years, absolutely go for it, because the way that these athletes now look after themselves, you see it with Fernando Alonso. You know, they hit 40, but their body feels like it's 30. So Fernando and Lewis and Sebastian, if he's got the motivation to do it, they've got the athleticism to do it. They'll have the reaction time for a little while still. It all comes down to desire, and if Lewis Hamilton wants that 8th World Championship and wants Mercedes to be back at the front, he'll get them there, and he'll stick around until he does so. But 300 Grand Prix, it's a elite club. Only 6 drivers have done it. Michael Schumacher, Jenson Button, Rubens Barrichello, Fernando Alonso and Kimi Raikkonen, the 5 other drivers, Lewis Hamilton making it 6. It's an elite group of drivers, and just congratulations to Lewis on such a fantastic, glittering career. And so to my driver ratings, we'll kick things off with the Red Bull team and the race winner Max Verstappen. I haven't spoken about Max so far in depth yet, but he drove a very good race. He challenged Leclair and he wore out his tyres early on, but his team always knew that the undercut was powerful, so there was always that opportunity. But once Leclerc was out of the race, Max did the job that he needed to do, make sure he managed the car, bring it home, because he's a world champion now. There's a bit more maturity. We may have seen a younger Max, I'm not quite sure what the right word is here. I don't want to say brash, but a slightly less matured Max Verstappen or another driver push for a dominant, crushing victory by 30 seconds. But wear out his tyres, make a mistake, all sorts of things can happen. But he commanded the race. He knew he was not under threat from Lewis Hamilton, because even if the Mercedes had got in DRS range, it would never have got past, because it just didn't have the straight line speed, even with DRS. So a brilliant victory for Max. Well managed, and he's now got such a commanding position. He's absolutely odds on to be world champion again. My only gripe is that he's not being made to work a little bit harder for him. But he's doing the job that he needs to do, and Ferrari are handing victories to him on a plate. And we've seen with Lewis Hamilton, if people want to hand you freebie wins, you take them and you don't look back. So for Max, he started second on the grid. He finished the race first. I'm going to rate his race as a 3.5. He said, "Today was a great day, but there are plenty more races ahead of us, and I just always aim for the most points possible. The fight is nowhere near over." I disagree. I think it isn't over yet, but obviously he's trying to manage expectations, but he's got a great position moving forwards. And his teammate Sergio Perez, who started third but finished fourth, he was actually overtaken by both Mercedes drivers in the race. I'm going to rate his performance as a 2. He said, "It was a difficult one out there today. I was off the pace and unfortunately wasn't able to get the podium we wanted. I struggled with tyre management, and it was tough to get on top of it." Yeah, the race got unstuck right at the start for Sergio. He didn't make a great start, especially in comparison to Lewis Hamilton. Couldn't pass the Mercedes, then got caught napping by George Russell. He blamed the virtual safety car messaging. Turns out there was a hardware problem, so there was 2 different VSC ending messages sent out, which apparently went out to all teams. So if that is true, Sergio only has himself to blame on that one. Let's move to Charles Leclerc, who started from pole position but finished in the wall. I'm going to rate his race as a 3.5 because up to that point he drove magnificently, and it was one small error which had massive consequences and has massively derailed his title ambitions again. He said, "I'm very disappointed. This is not the outcome that I wanted today, as we had the pace to win. I made a mistake and paid the price for it. Now I'll head home and reset before the next race in Hungary, where I will give it my all once again." And Charles is very good at owning his own mistakes, which I think is a really good quality in any form of life, because everyone makes mistakes in life. I've made mistakes. You, the listener or viewer, has probably made a mistake or 2 in their life as well, and it's about owning them and using them as a positivity to move forward and correct things. A mistake isn't always a bad thing, even though at the time it feels like terrible and awful and all those other adjectives. But Charles will come back. He will win more races this year, but he's definitely not going to win as many as he should have. His teammate Carlos Sainz started 19th and finished the race 5th. I'm going to rate him as a 3.5 as well. I thought it was a majestic drive through the field, well managed, because if you remember, he's dropped down the order in Australia, got a little bit too aggressive and ended up in the gravel on lap 2. He said it was a hard race today, but I also enjoyed going through the field, making lots of overtakes. To make places up with the hard tyres was tricky, but as soon as I put on the mediums, the pace improved a lot and I managed to make good moves. I think the pick of his moves was the one on Perez. It was just beautiful. Lined him up, sized him up around the outside into the penultimate corner, and made the move stick into the final turn, just blocking off the apex. A bit like a MotoGP block pass where you get down the inside and just sit on the apex. Let's move to Mercedes, who celebrated a double podium finish. Lewis Hamilton starting 4th and finishing the race 2nd. I'm going to rate him as a 3.5 as well. He said, "I wasn't expecting to fight for 2nd place or a podium, so this is a wonderful result for us. Our team has been amazing when it comes to reliability, and it shows that with dedication and focus, we can slowly make our way up." Mercedes, for all their porpoising and bouncing, both their cars have, I won't say made it to the finish in every race, because of course George Russell was out on lap 1 in Silverstone, but they've not had a mechanical DNF in the race yet. And this is 12 rounds in, when pretty much every other team has had one, and if you're Ferrari, you've had multiple. As for George Russell, he started 6th and finished the race 3rd, so a really good, nice drive from him. I'm going to give him a 3.5 as well. He said, "Our pace was strong, but we really struggled with the warm-up of the tyres on the restart, and Checo was strong today. I was glad to see the checkered flag and come home P3. We're making a lot of progress, and we really need to improve our qualifying performance, as we're lacking consistency there." Yeah, I mean, if that Mercedes was able to get on the front row, they could really do some damage, but the big problem, I think, for them is getting the tyres switched on early, but that is paying them dividends later on in the race. And their straight line speed, which, you know, we're not used to seeing with Mercedes. We're used to seeing these metaphorical silver bullets down the straight, and especially last year at the end of 2021, the Mercedes was just a rocket ship on the straights. Let's go to McLaren and Lando Norris. He qualified a brilliant 5th place, but he finished 7th. I'm going to rate Lando's race as a 3. He said it was a tough day, but I think it was what we expected. It was a long race, as we struggled a little bit with the degradation of the tyre, but also just with pure pace. We weren't as quick as we needed to be. Just tough, but I won't say disappointed. And McLaren had some upgrades on their car, and it seemed to work fairly well, and Lando got the job done in qualifying and picked up some handy points. Daniel Ricciardo started 9th, finished 9th, but he did qualify 11th, bumped up because of the penalties to Sainz and Magnussen, who got into Q3. Going to rate Daniel's performance as a 2.5, because he was just that half step behind Lando Norris. He said it's points, so that's positive. It's only 9th, but still important. He said that the tyres were good early on, but he struggled from the middle of the stint onwards. And Nico Rosberg made a good assessment, I think, of Daniel's performance at the moment. On paper, it doesn't look great, because this is only the 4th race that Daniel has scored in this season. But maybe we all just underestimated quite how good A, Lando Norris is, and B, how good Carlos Sainz is, because those two were driving brilliantly in the McLaren before Daniel turned up. And I think Ricciardo has a very unique driving style, especially on the brakes. So for him to be a little bit behind Norris, maybe that tells us more about Lando Norris than it does about Daniel Ricciardo. So we'll see how that pans out for the rest of the season. But I just thought that was an interesting insight from Nico Rosberg. Let's jump to Alpine, who have actually moved ahead of McLaren, because both their cars finished ahead of the McLarens. One ahead of one McLaren and then the other ahead of the second McLaren. Ocon, who was the second Alpine, started 10th, finished 8th, rating 2.5. He said the goal today was to score points with both cars, and we've done just that. Very happy with my race today. It was brilliant to drive in front of the home fans, who have been incredible all weekend. Yeah, only French driver to get points in Formula 1 this weekend. And the French fans were out in force. The French tricolour was waving, and it was a lovely atmosphere, actually. Fernando Alonso in the other Alpine, which started in 7th, finished 6th. I'm going to rate Fernando as a 3. He said, "I'm pleased with our race today. It was well executed, and we managed the pace and tyres well. We had to work through a lot of things in terms of car balance this weekend, but he was very happy with his performance." And of course that does put Alpine 4th outright in the Constructors' Championship. Moving on to Alfa Romeo then, Valtteri Bottas started 11th, finished 14th, going to rate him as a 2. He said it was a really long race and it felt like a lot of sweat with nothing to show for it, but of course you can learn something from every race, and that's what we must take away from this weekend. Zhou Guanyu started 16th, failed to finish. Another Ferrari power unit issue. There is a real plague within the Ferrari power units. I'm going to rate Zhou's performance as a 2. It was a quiet race for him. Well, unless you count hitting Mick Schumacher's Haas, but apart from that, there wasn't much to see from him. He said about 10 to 15 laps from the end, I was suffering with a power unit issue. I tried to do some switching, but eventually that put an end to my race. And moving on to Kevin Magnussen's Haas. He started 20th and last, also failed to finish. He had a bit of contact with Nicholas Latifi. I'm going to rate Kevin's performance as a 2.5 because he actually got the Haas into Q3. Yes, he had new power unit elements, but still, good effort, really solid effort. He said, we gave it our best and I tried very hard today, made some good moves, but at the end of the day, the degradation on the tyres was high. The car was great at the beginning of stints and our pace was fantastic as we saw yesterday in qualifying. But qualifying didn't quite go to plan for Mick Schumacher. He had got himself into Q2, but then had his lap deleted for cutting turn 3. He claimed he didn't, but the onboard shot suggested he did, although you couldn't see the rear tyres, so there was a little bit of ambiguity there. So he started from 17th, finished 15th. I'm going to rate him as a 2. Haas, they went for this really bold 2-stop strategy, and then the safety car came out and kind of ruined their day. And everyone else got a free pit stop, which Mick Schumacher was a bit upset about. He said, we had a difficult start on the mediums. It didn't really work as well as we hoped. We knew it was going to be tough, so we came in early, and unfortunately there was the safety car. Pierre Gasly on home soil didn't get out of Q1, having shown some decent pace in practice, so he started 14th and finished 12th. There is a helicopter going around outside, so I hope you can hear me. Anyway, Pierre Gasly, going to rate him as a 2 for his 12th place finish. He said, we tried to fight to get back in the points, and what we managed is P12, which clearly isn't the performance we would have liked. But he said he did enjoy racing in front of his home fans, and they put a big smile on his face. Yuki Tsunoda qualified in Q3, so the performance was there in the AlphaTauri this weekend, but then he failed to finish after being clouted by Esteban Ocon on the opening lap. I must mention that Ocon picked up a 5-second time penalty and still managed to finish in the points, so good effort makes his effort even better. But for Yuki, it's only a 2. He said, I got quite a lot of damage early on and it just kept getting worse with each lap. He said he felt like he definitely left enough space and Ocon lost control, which is probably fair. These things happen in racing, but it is a shame after such a good qualifying. Yeah, it would have been interesting to see how Tsunoda had fared, but I think he may have dropped back and maybe just finished 10th, maybe 11th. And talking of 10th and 11th, that's where the two Aston Martins finished. Seb Vettel starting 12th, finishing 11th, rating a 2. He said my afternoon was frustrating. I was stuck in traffic for the whole race, but you expect that when you start in the midfield. And there was not much more the team could have done with strategy. Lance Stroll went from 15th to 10th. I'm going to rate him as a 2.5. He said we had a great first lap. That set us up to have a great race. He said it was a good fight with Sebastian, but the most important thing was to bring home a point for the team today. And concluding the driver ratings with Williams, Alex Albon started 13th, finished 13th, rating 2.5. He said it was tricky out there, but more enjoyable. And they were in contention for most of the race and looking close to the points. And Nicholas Latifi, he started 18th and he failed to finish. He did clatter into Kevin Magnussen. Going to rate him as a 2. Said there are positives to take from today. The pace was competitive and I was racing cars that I haven't been racing against all year, so that's been nice. I definitely don't think I was at fault for the incident with Kevin, maybe more of a racing incident. It was borderline a racing incident and borderline Nicholas's fault because he didn't quite leave Kevin enough room on the inside, and then Magnussen was on the curb and that's unsettled the car. So yeah, maybe slightly more Nicholas's fault, but still, yeah, maybe a racing incident. But anyway, there are your driver ratings from me. If you agree or disagree, then let me know in the comments. We have a shared top performer in Max Verstappen, Charles Leclerc, Carlos Sainz, Lewis Hamilton and George Russell. So out of those 5, who impressed you the most this weekend? Answer that in the comments or send me a tweet at 5_red_lights. And now the time has come to rate the race. I'm going to give it a 6 out of 10. There was some excitement through the field and some good battles, and the battle between Leclerc and Verstappen was hotting up really nicely until Charles Leclerc crashed. And after that, the main action was Carlos Sainz's progress and the subsequent meltdown on the Ferrari pit wall, which made us all tear our hair out and cry with laughter at the same time. Potentially brilliant race was taken away from us when Leclerc crashed, and I fear also a competitive championship too. Louis Edwards, Tom Downey and Carl King from the F1 Grid Talk gang gave the race a 5 out of 10, while Jared Partridge gave the race a 4. Let me know your race ratings in the comments below as well. And let's see how my predictions fared. You can find my predictions on my blog ahead of every race at 5redlights.wixsite.com/5RL pod blog. Wow, my words this morning, or this afternoon now. So pole position, I went for Charles Leclerc and he bagged the pole position, and I went for Lewis Hamilton to win the race, which he just missed out on. Perez to finish second, he didn't even make the podium, but Russell did finish third, so I got 1 out of 3 there. My bold predictions were Leclerc and Verstappen to DNF, 1 out of 2. Gasly to make Q3, he didn't even make Q2, but there was double points for McLaren, which I correctly predicted. And that brings the checkered flag down on this week's Grand Prix Cap. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you enjoyed this episode. You can find more from me on f1chronicle.com and insidef2.com, where I contribute articles on race weekends. You can also find me on Instagram, 5redlights, Twitter at 5_red_lights, and my personal Twitter is AaronHarper41. It's just a few days until the Hungarian Grand Prix in Budapest, where Lewis Hamilton has won 8 times. Could he add a 9th before the summer break? It's going to be difficult, but you know, if anyone can, Lewis can. But I think the favourite might be Charles Leclerc, even though he threw this one away. If you like this episode, please rate it on Apple or Spotify. If you're watching the episode on YouTube, like it, subscribe. Either of those would be fantastically helpful, and I'll give a shout out to anyone who does rate the show or subscribe. Make sure you share your subscriptions on YouTube so I know that you've subscribed. I can give you a shout out then. Remember to be kind, to enjoy the racing, and I will see you when the 5 red lights go out.